because there we go. Because sometimes people are, we've had sort of people dipping in and out and catching up with the recordings instead. After this session, I will send to everyone who's registered for any of these calls all a list of all the links to all the recordings if you want to watch things again.
Thank you.
And for today's session, especially, I really do encourage you to ask questions and kind of help us direct the conversation, because it's a really big topic. It's probably too much for one session, actually. So I've tried to keep the slides part that I prepared a little bit shorter than in the previous sessions, and then really looking to hear from you kind of where do you want me to fill in more. So we're going to try to kind of cover in brief the different aspects of the 7th of October and its aftermaths. But I'm hopefully going to leave a bit of time for you to say, actually, could you say a little bit more on this or on that? I also just want to frame this that I'm not trying to make a political statement in terms of how much time I'm dedicating to one topic or another. I'm partly trying to, what I'm partly trying to do is to look at the different aspects of the 7th of October and its aftermath, and especially cover those things that maybe you are less likely to have heard lots about because it's not so much in the Western media. That is not to say that I'm trying to ignore all of the things that are a lot in the media, but I'm just trying to kind of provide you with the added value. I should also say on that that I'm not a journalist. I'm not pretending to be a journalist. In the end, I'm a rabbi. I'm a witness to what was going on. I'm like all of you, we kind of feel linked to this. So I don't claim to have any kind of objectivity on the matter. And I'm bringing all my subjective baggage with me into this. Feel free to disagree with some of the things that I'm saying. I recognize that people look at things from a different perspectives, and that there's a lot of tension in the air about many of the things we're going to be talking about. I invite you to share your views with us if you feel comfortable, or if you don't feel so comfortable, then feel free to not share them and share them with me afterwards or something. Also, as this is our last session, if you have feedback, if there are things where you say, actually, this was really interesting, I'd love to hear more. If you're interested in other sessions, just let me know. If you think that it was all really rubbish and please don't ever offer anything again, that's also fine to hear. I guess you can also just vote with your feet in that case. But it's really, I would love to hear your input on that as well. So happy to take some feedback on that. Today, I'm going to share my screen with you again as in the past. Hopefully, the presentation will not crash as much as it did last time because there are less videos. So we are on session 4, right? October the 7th and its aftermath. And I've entitled it Hostage Crisis War, What Now? Now, I thought I'll start with this slide. Some of you will be familiar with this image that was created. It's clearly the 7th of October. If for those who read Hebrew, you can see that they have kind of created the word zachor out of it, remember. Oftentimes with the word zachor, right, we associate kind of the momentous moments. And I think it's not an understatement to frame the 7th of October as being one of the most critical moments in the history of the State of Israel in terms of its self-understanding. Its self-understanding as a state that keeps the Jews safe, and really kind of the facing the reality of, for many people, I think it felt like history revisited, right? That we would basically see a pogrom happening in the 21st century, but not just in a foreign land, in Poland or in Russia, but in Israel itself, in the sovereign state of Israel. That in and of itself, I think, is something that is sometimes very difficult for people from the outside to understand, that it really felt like a historical moment that shifted people's self-understanding, that shifted people's understanding of what was right, what was wrong, were the other side capable of. By the 7th of October, we had reached sort of a level where there were large numbers of Israeli society, not just on the right, but to the center left, who had sort of got used to the reality of, well, we can live with the Palestinians side by side with strong fences and the occupation, and we just manage the problems. We manage the problems and they're manageable. I think the 7th of October was for people a real breaking point of, this is not manageable. This is not manageable. Something needs to change profoundly, and it cannot continue as before. So I'm not going to do a huge recap of what happened. I would say that it's important to note that even now there is still a huge level that we don't quite know and understand of what happened. Some of it is actively being investigated, is under wraps because there are confidentiality issues and all of these things, but also because of the huge amount of havoc that was wreaked, that really communities were completely destroyed. The communities around the Gaza envelope were really completely ransacked. I mean, it depends a little bit on the different locations, and I'm going to show you a map in a moment of the Gaza envelope area. But so some of the kibbutzim, I personally visited 2 kibbutzim. I visited Kfar Aza at the beginning of December. I visited Nir Oz in February. Kfar Aza is a larger kibbutz on the northern edge of the northern Gaza Strip, so quite close to Gaza City. Some parts of the kibbutz are utterly destroyed. Like it's unimaginable to think that this amount of damage can be done without like aerial bombardment. That's how terrible it is. And the other parts of the kibbutz actually are fairly intact. And there are some areas of the kibbutz where the terrorists never went. And we'll look at the map a little bit and say a few things about what we know, why some of these things happened. In Nir Oz, for instance, there is basically not a single house in Nir Oz that is still inhabitable. It's really utterly destroyed. And it's one of the kibbutzim, sorry. I'm going to let my emotions flow in the session because there's no other way of talking about this. So in Kibbutz Nir Oz, for instance, Nir Oz had about 400 residents, and about a quarter of all the residents were either murdered or kidnapped. So that's kind of the extent of the damage that that happened in the on the 7th of October. We now think that there were about 1,194 individuals murdered. The reason why the number is still not quite clear is that there are still people that they're not sure that they can identify. Many people, it took archaeologists to identify people. That's how bad it was. So we're not entirely certain. Also, there are still individuals that are now being declared as dead based on the analysis of the evidence that are who are kidnapped. So families still receive now, even 5 months, almost 6 months after the news that you thought your children were kidnapped, but actually they probably died on the 7th of October already. So it's a very, very, very slow process in many cases. One of the reasons why it's so critical, of course, is that a lot of the things like benefits that you're entitled to, it changes whether your spouse, for instance, is dead or is kidnapped, right? There are like, you know, if you're a soldier and you fall in war or in while you're enlisted, your relatives are entitled to special benefits. But if you're kidnapped, you're in this limbo. So it's taking a really very, very long time, and there's still a huge amount of uncertainty. I'm gonna just take this screen share off, and I want to share with you, sorry, 1 second. I want to share with you a map of the area. This is a I will say outright, this is a Government of Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs produced map. So take it in that regard. I'm just gonna zoom in a little bit. I think I can do that. So you can access this. I'm happy to share the links, but if you search for map of what happened on the 7th of October, you get it. So it's an interactive map where you see here the Gaza Strip, right? Gaza City, the largest city, is here in the north of the Gaza Strip. Khan Yunis, kind of central Gaza Strip. We don't actually, in this perspective, you know, here is Rafah, that's the Egyptian border. What happened is that really there was a mass infiltration along what we call the Gaza envelope. So the whole area around some of the kibbutzim that I talked about here. Nir Oz is really faces Khan Yunis, utterly destroyed. Kfar Aza is here further in the north. And the map actually, what the map shows you is every dot is a murdered person. Every red dot, every kind of green dot is somebody kidnapped. The blue dots are people who were kidnapped and who were later released. And then we think there are about 4,834 injured. You can see that the terrorists went as far as Ofakim, which is actually not part of the Gaza envelope. It's an Israeli town, and in Ofakim, for instance, all the kibbutzim and all the moshavim along this Gaza envelope every house has a safe room. Every house is a safe room. It's a government requirement. It was paid for by the government because they've suffered rocket fire from Gaza for decades now. In Ofakim, they do not have personal safe rooms. The government, it's too far away from the Gaza Strip. And many of the people who were killed in Ofakim were killed as they were running to public shelters. They were gunned down as they were running to public shelters. And one of the really challenging things about Ofakim was that because it's that far away from the Gaza Strip, actually the families in Ofakim were not entitled to be evacuated. So you have still parts of the city completely, like you can see here, where the dots are, parts of the city of Ofakim, parts of the neighborhoods is utterly destroyed. And you will have, if we zoom in, you see that lots of people were really killed basically along one street. You can really zoom in here. Or along a couple of streets running to the public shelters. And I visited Ofakim, and what's really heartbreaking is right here is a kindergarten, and the kids are still, they have to walk past the destroyed houses every day, the destroyed shelters, seeing the signs of all the people who were killed. Many of them witnessed people being killed, but they were not entitled to any, to be evacuated. I think some of them were allowed to appeal to the government and got 2 weeks respite, but then had to return, unless their houses were utterly destroyed, in which case they couldn't return. So we see here that really the area, and you see a lot of the time, right, the route of destruction, basically people, the terrorists traveling and shooting people as they were going along. Oftentimes along these roads, the people the dots that are sort of the random dots, where many of them were policemen who, we'll talk about what all the things that went wrong, but initially the army really did not show up. But policemen from the area, policemen from Beersheba, and other policemen started to come, and they were often only armed with like a pistol, and often gunned down. Now, I talked about Kfar Aza, certain parts of Kfar Aza still not being as destroyed. It's probably due to the fact that terrorists were redirected. We now know, for instance, the Nova Festival site, that the Hamas terrorists, this was the most deadly site of all of them. I'll show you a few pictures in a moment. And we know that the terrorists did not know that the festival was happening, and they actively redirected forces to the festival. The army has analyzed like recordings and WhatsApp messages, and they actively redirected forces. So some of the smaller kibbutzim, like for instance Netivot was an interesting kibbutz. It was attacked, and the civil guard of the kibbutz managed to fight off the terrorists that arrived, and they couldn't get into the kibbutz. So there were a few individuals from the civilian guard killed. I think 3 people were killed in Netivot. But then they couldn't get in, and they actually redirected to come back to Nova Festival to kill more young people at the Nova Festival. And we know this, and we know there were reports of the different terrorist groups that came with their different commanders and their different approaches. So, for instance, we have first reports from a family in Kibbutz Nachal Oz. They were held hostage in their house in the kibbutz. 2 families together, they had been dragged out of their safe rooms. The terrorists held them hostage in the house for several hours. There was a mother with a baby as part of the families. The terrorists even went back to her house to get baby food for the baby. And after several hours, they said to the women, you sit down on the floor and the men come with us and are going to be hostages with us. And they only took the men. Whereas in other cases, they took men, women, children, elderly, and so on. So there were clearly different groups there. I think one of the things that a lot of the residents of the neighborhoods were really especially pained by was the looting, that following the terrorists came civilians who looted and looted everything. So the woman who showed us around Nir Oz, for instance, shared that when she was liberated from her safe room by the IDF, after more than 12 hours in the safe room, where she had only secured the door with an old oar that she had taken from some far abroad trip and a part of her Hoover. That's what she used to barricade the door when they were rescued by the soldiers. Everything in her house had been stolen, including all their shoes. So and that was like, it's interesting what like made people there cry. It's like that made her cry, that they stole all her shoes. That like she couldn't even keep her shoes anymore. So really heartbreaking. I mean, utterly heartbreaking events. I'm not going to say more because otherwise it's going to just make me cry. Um, and I want to show you a little bit more, kind of do a bit more analysis with you. If we look back at 1 second, I just need to get the right screen for me again. So I talked about the Nova Festival. This is kind of gives you a bit of an idea of what it looked like, the Nova Festival. So what the group that organized the festival did actually was that they took everything that was left from the festival site and kind of recreated it in the as a temporary exhibition at the Tel Aviv Expo. So you see, it was like a totally normal music festival. You see here a little bit already the destruction. You see the beautiful like visual imagery of really beautiful space, kind of trance festival, whatever. And then the burned out cars, the portaloos that were completely riddled with bullet holes, and a huge section of lost and found of all the things that people left behind. So there were 364 murdered at the Nova Festival site. About 40 hostages were taken from there. Amongst the 364 killed were 17 police officers. That was literally the only people who came to try and help for many, many hours. And there were about 3,500 attendees. So that gives you kind of a bit of an idea of more than 10% of the attendees were either murdered or kidnapped. The site now is a memorial site. It's it's in a different area. There's the car graveyard of all the burned out cars. They were strewn all across. People were trying to flee in their cars. And then there's at the site this kind of temporary memorial to the individuals. People planting flowers and so on. What went wrong? Well, a lot of things went wrong, clearly. There was very clearly a failure to take note of the intelligence information that was available. We know that now, that they had received reports primarily from female spotters. That was their job. Many of whom lost their lives on the 7th of October. Because a lot of the spotters actually didn't even have guns. in their base, because they were supposed to just sit in front of the computer and watch CCTV. So there was a huge failure to take the intelligence information that was available into account. They had pulled lots of forces into the West Bank because there'd been trouble at West Bank over the summer. It really had become quite unsafe. So they thought trouble is in the West Bank, not coming from Gaza. The civilian security forces, it had just come in as a new rule just before Rosh Hashanah. A new rule was passed that the civilian security forces of the kibbutz were no longer allowed to have their weapons in their houses. They had to leave them in the guard post. So most of them did not have access to their weapons, and many of the civilian security forces were in fact murdered as they were trying to run to get their guns and weapons. There was total chaos and total lack of army control. It will take a very long time to really understand why this happened. Part of it was that the Central Command for the southern region was located directly on the Gaza Strip, and they were overrun as well. And a number of them, the senior officers, were killed. The second thing that happened that we now already know is that the generals who were in the Central Command in Tel Aviv, which is the Kiryat, where the Central Command is, what they had done is they had followed protocol, which means that you have to leave your mobile phones outside the secure area where you get all your security information, which means that they actually didn't get any of the messages. So for many hours, the journalists and civilians or retired service personnel knew more than the generals knew. The generals just simply didn't get any information. So there was like an absolute lack of control. When I visited in December, I visited at one of the Air Force bases, and the Air Force pilot said, well, so I got called at 12:30 p.m. in the afternoon on 7th of October, I got a call that I'm to report to the base. And somebody asked, what do you mean 12:30 p.m.? The whole thing started around 6 a.m., or really with the masses of rockets at 6:30 a.m. Why did you only get a call at 12:30 p.m.? And he said, I'm sorry, but I don't think my rank is high enough to be able to answer that question. But clearly the fact that they weren't even called up, huge challenge. And then the final point is that there was also, in addition, a slowed response time due to the public holiday and a lack of transport. And many people literally drove their kids who were still in the army, who had been released or their spouses who'd been on holiday leave for the Chag. They literally drove them in private cars to the south, because there was just nothing, there wasn't even a report here. Everything was complete chaos. So lots of things went wrong. We will see if there will ever be an investigation. It appears that Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, is going to try to be prime minister for as long as possible to not be able to have an investigation. Very, very clearly, the army people, many of the army generals have said, we have to accept responsibility for this. There haven't been mass resignations because of the war, but people have said as soon as the war is done, we need to accept responsibility. The government ministers have so far completely failed to accept any responsibility, and that is leading to a lot of anger in society. What went right? I thought we can't just do with what went wrong. What went right? What did go well? the response from civil society really was incredible. I mean, first of all, we have incredibly heroic stories of literally individuals going to rescue other people's kids. Yair Golan, who's now running for the leadership of the Labour Party, retired general, you know, he just literally, people were texting him, WhatsApping him locations. He rescued several of the people from the Nova Festival. And there were other stories. Amir Tibon, the journalist from the diplomatic correspondent of Haaretz, his father, also a retired general, Noam Tibon, literally came and rescued the family, like personally. So there were like unbelievable stories of personal heroism, but there was also an enormous civic society response in terms of pop-up centers to support soldiers that were called up. They were making thousands of pizzas and burgers a day for the soldiers that were called up, because people literally, they called up there were about 100,000 people mobilized. Israel has never called up that many people for reserve duty. People literally didn't get beds. So people who were called up for reserve duty in Tel Aviv had to find like home hospitality to sleep, because they were called up and they weren't given a bed in the army, by the army, because they didn't have anything. And really, it was all civic society. The groups we talked about, the groups Brothers and Sisters in Arms, as part of the protest movement, they really immediately popped up. Remember that protest camp that I talked about last time? They popped up and they built all of these pop-up centers. People opened their homes. Here, like, they started, this is Brothers and Sisters in Arms, started a kindergarten, right? Helping in agriculture, helping people to find new jobs, collecting clothes. People were making sandwiches for the soldiers. The soldiers weren't getting fed by the army because they didn't have anything to feed suddenly 100,000. So really, the civic society response was absolutely incredible. And for the first few weeks, really afterwards, right, then the big slogan became Beyachad Nanatzer, together we will win, we will succeed. Very much in the, we used to be split with the whole protest movement, now we're going to be together. And that sort of worked. It was already starting to wear off by the beginning of December, this sense of, because it was starting to be that people said, well, we're not really together, because some of us are really badly affected by this, and others, you know, the government are just keep on going as if nothing happens. So for instance, in the same week that Israelis were literally making sandwiches for their kids who were called up to reserve duty, the ultra-Orthodox parties in the government tried to push a bill to increase the stipends to yeshiva students. And like, that wasn't even ironic. Like, yeah, I know, like, we kind of want to laugh about it because it seems so absurd, but they just kind of as if it didn't happen. So the Beyachad together was always like quite fragile. Overwhelming for the sense of Israel's understanding of the 7th of October really is the hostage crisis, which is ongoing. That's my 10th t-shirt, right? I have the Hebrew version of Bring Them Home Now. Time is running out. HaChatufim adayin sham. The hostages are still there. There were about 114 individual hostages were either released or freed by the Israeli army. Of the 109 of the ones that were released, those were released, 24 were foreign workers. Because actually Hamas indiscriminately kidnapped. And one of the interesting things that happened with 7th of October is that actually the Israeli Arabs in all the surveys say they now feel closer to their Jewish co-citizens than they did before 7th of October, because they saw that actually Arabs were also indiscriminately slaughtered. So many of the victims were Bedouin, Druze soldiers, but also, for instance, at the Nova Festival, it was a very famous scene because it was recorded on video of a Arab ambulance driver, paramedic, who drove to, he heard the call that there was something happening. He drove his ambulance there. A terrorist makes him come out of the ambulance. He holds up his hands and says in Arabic, "But I'm an Arab, please don't kill me. All I'm trying to do is help injured people." And the terrorist just says traitor and shoots him dead. So actually for a lot of the Arab Israeli citizens, it was also a huge wake-up call of, well, who are we with? Where do we belong? And one of the interesting things that didn't happen with this current Gaza war, despite the fact that it's clearly the most violent and brutal of the Gaza, the others were classed as operations in the last few years, is that we didn't see the Israeli Arabs turn against their fellow Jewish Israelis, but instead that actually they are really standing side by side in many cases. So the hostage crisis remains everywhere. Everywhere you go in Israel, on the bus stops, you see the posters. Everyone talks about the stories of the individuals. In Tel Aviv, outside the Tel Aviv Art Museum, if you know it, they renamed the square called Hostage and Missing Persons Square. There are a variety of art exhibitions drawing attention to it. It changes every time. Every time you go, there's a different thing. So this was relatively new in February. It's a tunnel, you can go through it so that you can experience maybe what it feels like to be one of the hostages after the hostages were released. We know that many of them were taken back and forth in these tunnels as well. The empty Shabbat table that also happened around the world and so on. I don't want to gloss over the fact that the Gaza war, of course, is ongoing and catastrophic for the civilian population in Gaza. We see in the early stages until the 27th of October, mass mobilization, air raids on Gaza, evacuation orders for the northern Gaza Strip. I don't think it's reported that much, but many of the hostages also confirmed this, is that Israel actually, even with the air raids, Israel has a practice. I think they have now made over 40,000 phone calls to individual Palestinians to try and get them to leave neighborhoods before they are bombed. They also use a method, they call it the knock-knock bomb, where before they drop the bomb that will actually flatten the building, they will drop about 25 minutes before a very small device, which basically falls onto the roof, and it's like knock, 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 knock. And then you have 25 minutes to run out of the building and leave the building before the building is flattened. They still use flyers and so on. But despite it all, of course, there are huge numbers of deaths. We only have numbers from the Hamas-run ministry, which claims that there are 32,000 dead, including 13,000 children. we will not know exact numbers, maybe ever. I think one of the things that Israelis always talk about is Hamas can release the figures of so many people dead in this airstrike within like 20 minutes of it happening. We are still counting the people that died on 7th of October. So, what does that mean about accuracy, right? And we find that there are situations where initial claims by Hamas are clearly contradicted, like the incident of the hospital attack on the 17th of October, which was kind of indiscriminately reported by the Western media with the fact, as if Hamas had supplied them with facts, and it seems quite clear that it's not. On the other hand, it's very clear also war means that there are people who things happen that shouldn't happen. I think it will be very clear there will be things happening that Israeli soldiers do, that the army does, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. But that is unfortunately one of the consequences of warfare. And in addition, at the moment now, Gazans civilians really face mass starvation. There was an interesting article that yesterday in the Israeli press by a very lefty journalist about how actually the levels of dissatisfaction of the Gazan population with Hamas are increasing, which nobody is reporting on. That apparently the most popular name for your donkey is now Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, because that way you can beat your donkey and shout at Yahya Sinwar at the same time without having to face repercussions. So there is real unrest happening. There were, for instance, demonstrations in Gaza to call on Hamas to release the hostages, which I'm sure you didn't read in any of your newspapers, where they said, we don't want to pay the price for these stupid 134 hostages, just let them go. There's also now a growing resentment against the Palestinian prisoners that Hamas is demanding to be released, with Gazans saying, well, they chose to engage in acts of terror. Why should we be paying the price? And people talk a lot about previous very serious wars where actually the PLO made sure that the people don't starve. Whereas Hamas, and they are saying, Hamas is a totalitarian organization. They managed to suppress us in all sorts of ways, but for some reason they can't stop aid being looted and sold on the black market for a very large amount of money. So people are starting to talk about that. We don't really hear it. It's very difficult to report independently from Gaza, because if you write something about Gaza and Hamas that Hamas doesn't like, it is not safe for you as a journalist to return to Gaza. It's that simple. You can write whatever you like about Israel. They might kick you out of the country. That has happened, but it's not going to endanger your life. It's not the same story with Gaza. So we have to keep that in mind when we read the news. But all that being said, it is a catastrophic situation for many, many people who didn't have much choice and were dragged into this as well. So where are we 6 months on? The coalition is in crisis, question mark. If I'd done this session on Thursday, I would have said, maybe by Sunday the coalition will collapse, because about 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, 24th of March, I believe, Gideon Saar quit the government. He was one of the groups with his New Hope Party that entered the government as part of the war coalition. So it started to look like, will the war coalition break down? At the moment, Gantz is still hanging on. It's an interesting thing with Gideon Saar leaving. It was seen as, will that give Benny Gantz the permission to leave? And would that then be enough to push the coalition over the edge? At the moment, that has not yet happened. The reason why I say things might have been different based on whether it was last week or now is the conscription bill, which Defense Minister Gallant of the Likud party insisted the Supreme Court had ruled a while ago that the government's provision to exempt yeshiva students from military service was not in accordance with equality legislation. And they would either have to fix the bill, or from the 1st of April onwards, ultra-Orthodox men would be conscripted into the army like everyone else. No more Torah exemption. And Defense Minister Gallant said, if you do a bill that exempts the ultra-Orthodox, I will walk out of the government, which would have likely collapsed the government. But everyone said, well, if Netanyahu doesn't fix it, then the ultra-Orthodox parties will walk out. Very interestingly, the ultra-Orthodox parties did not walk out, even though as of 1st of April, all ultra-Orthodox men will have to be conscripted into the army. There are mass protests in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods by the ultra-Orthodox against the draft, by secular people in favor of drafting the ultra-Orthodox. But it is a historical moment. 1st of April 2024 ended a rule that was put in place at the founding of the State of Israel, namely the exemption of ultra-Orthodox Torah students, or Talmud students really, but they call them Torah students, from military service. The mass protests have returned. The hostage families are at the helm of them. At first, they were just protests to call for the release of the hostages. Now the demands for immediate elections are getting louder and louder. For a very long time, many Israelis had said, it's not good, we are at war, we shouldn't do it, but people's patience is running out as we near the 6 months mark. And what we see is the tents are back. There is again a tent protest outside the Knesset. People are sleeping in tents outside the Knesset, protesting for early elections. It is what I think is important to say, because it's not self-evident, is it is very unlikely that early elections and immediate elections will mean anything different to the war. It is very, very clear that the overwhelming majority of Israelis says very clearly the war cannot end while Hamas still has the ability to be in political power. We need to be able to rebuild homes and put kids back to sleep in those kibbutzim along the Gaza envelope. We cannot allow this to continue to happen. But I think there would be much greater efforts at a hostage deal exchange, probably a very long ceasefire agreement of several months. But it's very clear Israelis really, it's a very tiny minority that says we should just stop. Everyone else is very clear. Hamas cannot continue. And at the moment, it's still not clear what other Palestinian alternative would step up. I'm going to show you a 50-second video of the most recent protests, which was circulating in all the WhatsApp groups yesterday. And in that time, you can think about what questions you want to ask or comments you want to make. And I hope that the video will work. And I should have said the protests that these most recent protests now in Jerusalem was the first time since the 7th of October that all the groups that were part of the protest movement before the 7th of October decided to join the protest. For a very long time until that moment, especially brothers and sisters in arms were really focused on the relief efforts and so on. But now really everyone is back together, and maybe not so much biyachad nenatzeach, together we will succeed. It's again a very fragile moment that we find ourselves in. I'm gonna give you the opportunity to ask questions, make comments, share your thoughts. Just unmute yourself and go for it. Celia.
In relation to what you said fairly early on this evening about the Israeli Arabs, and I agree, I read the same sort of thing early on. I read an article, I think in Haaretz this week, of an Israeli Arab saying, we don't feel that we're Israeli Arabs, we feel that we are Palestinian Israelis. And we're reaching boiling point. And so I wondered if you have any other views on that or other echoes.
So I think it's a very, very complicated situation, because even before this current conflict, there is no such thing as a kind of one Palestinian. That the East Jerusalemites are very different to the West Bank Palestinians, to the Haifa Israeli Arabs. And so part of the problem is when you interview individuals, you get an individual snapshot and you can kind of be a little bit self-selective. And I mean, I'm an avid Haaretz reader, but the reality is you can find any story that you want to tell and focus on. The surveys that they have done, where they've really tried to do more objective data, like interviewing hundreds or in some cases thousands, actually show a very clear trend of stronger association. But of course, as the war progresses, as it becomes more and feels more and more indulgent, just like the Jewish Israeli hostage families are running out of patience, so do the Arabs run out of patience. So yeah, it's definitely true that there are some there. The other thing I should say is, of course, there's a huge level of, depending on what kind of media you consume. And we see a huge amount in the Arab-speaking press of literally denial of facts. You know, you see it in the Western press too, right? Where people just like make like completely outrageous claims that, like, you know, oh, all these reports about sexual crimes, that can't be true. Like Muslims would never do such a thing. And even though there is plenty of evidence for all these atrocities, you know, they'll find the one case where somebody reported something and then it was found not to be quite as it seemed, in order to disprove it. So depending on what news people consume, they also get a very different picture of what's going on right now. Thank you. Aaron, yes. I think you're on mute, sorry.
Myself. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was brilliant, really thoughtful and constructive, and obviously very, very firmly felt and lovely. Sitting where I am, Israel's in a dreadful pickle, and she's totally lost the high ground, the high moral ground. What do you think she could do to get it back?
So I think it would be good. I think early elections would set a clear signal. I think partly also because it would hopefully put a politician in charge who is at least not so arrogant as Netanyahu. Although there are Netanyahu is actually an incredible diplomat in the sense of how he can communicate. He is an orator. He is very charismatic. So there are lots of things that I'm not a Netanyahu fan, but there are lots of things he does very, very well. He's a very good maneuverer. But I do think early elections would set a signal. It would say, we are setting a different standard. I think the other thing that Israel should do is to facilitate more aid going into Gaza. I think Israel should think about allowing foreign journalists who want to go into Gaza and then be left to run around and rummage around by themselves, even though that might put them in danger, should consider doing that. At the moment, they are only allowing foreign journalists to go kind of embedded with the army. I think that would potentially help, because there might actually be some foreign journalists who start, reporting that, there are actually there is a bit of discontent against Hamas from the Gazans and so on. But I think that part of it is just it needs to bring the war to an end. And there are voices that say, well, maybe it would have been better if Israel hadn't tried to be so slow and humane and do the knocking, which also allowed the terrorists to go, and they should have just flattened whole sections, and it would have been 50,000 dead in 10 days, but the war would have been over. And maybe that would have been the better solution. I mean, I definitely wouldn't want to advocate that, but this is the challenge. Urban warfare is very slow and very long and very painful and very ugly. So part of it is just riding it out and recognizing that probably people will lose interest as soon as it's over, unfortunately. But maybe coming up with the two-state solution would be really good too, but I think that's at the moment wishful thinking. Even if we get a Gantz government, I don't think it's very likely that we're going to get very close to a two-state solution. Also, there's no, at the moment, no viable Palestinian alternative to take over from Hamas in Gaza, unfortunately. Sam and then Stanislav.
Hear me?
Yeah.
So violence in this region is something that has been a part of my life since before I was born. And like you said, the biggest issue is how it's represented in media, repeated denial of fact, and especially as somebody who has feet, one foot each in both Muslim and Arab communities here and also Jewish communities here, I was struck when everything was kicking up, especially last year, how much nonsense people I loved were posting on social media from both, perspectives. So I guess I would like to ask, how do you know how to sift through the nonsense? And how do you confront people that you love when they are very well intentionally spreading hateful rubbish?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult. It's a real challenge. I probably won't do this justice in the minute that I'm going to take in trying to answer this, so I'm happy to kind of pick it up later as well. I saw this fantastic meme somebody posted on the 1st of April, one of my Israeli friends. 1st of April, the only day when people on social media actually think before they repost to see if it's rubbish. Because the reality is people repost stuff really without any fact checking. So I guess for me, the way I kind of respond to people who repost some really hateful things are, first of all, I try to give them the benefit of the doubt and not assume immediately that they actually really believe and have really scrutinized and put their faith behind the rubbish that they're sharing, that maybe they've just, pressed repost because it seemed kind of cool, and therefore maybe I shouldn't be so personally angry at them. And then I try to share by saying, this is how what you shared makes me feel. So because actually, I think when we go down the factual route, we are moving in a conversation in a direction which is not actually what's happening on social media. It's all about how we feel. And actually, one of the most effective ways to combat that is to say, I, as someone who you like and appreciate, this really scares me, or it really upsets me, or I feel really threatened by this. And then to explain why that is the case. And I find that that's more productive than trying to say, but look, here's the fact and this fact and whatever. So that's one of the things. And how do I fact check? I try to trust still reputable news sources. I don't just believe things on the internet. And I personally don't share and reshare things on the internet. I really try to say, actually, is there a news report? If it's only happened 15 minutes ago, I'm not gonna make a judgment. And I also often say to people, I am not someone who's with any kind of military background. I have no idea whether that is a smart military move or not. I can't judge that. I have no idea. I don't know at all, but neither do you. Because unless you're having this debate with a military expert, you don't know. Stanislav, yes, please.
Yes. So this war is horrible, but this war, as any other war, will end at some point. And the question is, what will be happening the day after the war?
Yeah.
So my question is, there is this possibility of elections. Is this an issue that is really discussed, or are there any proposals by the parties, or different proposals, maybe conflicting proposals, about what to do the day after? Because I haven't heard that, and I'm worried that I mean, in Israel, they don't really think enough about that, and this seems to be crucial and important now to think about that, not just wait, to the moment the war is over.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and I think there is a huge level of just people can't even wrap their heads around it, and people are so stuck in the moment. And I mean, one of the things that everyone in Israel says is for you guys in the diaspora, 7th of October is something that happened in the past. For us, it's happening every day over and over again in everything we encounter. So there is a level of hopelessness of it's just all lost. On the other hand, I would say that certainly before 7th of October already, we were starting to see much more movement and people thinking about we need to find a solution for the occupation. So one of the things that the pro-democracy movement really achieved is that people realize actually part of what corrupted our democracy and what made our democracy fragile was that a democracy maintaining an undemocratic occupation already poisons the soul of the democracy. So there are people talking. There are a number of groups that are coming up with some creative proposals. At the moment, there is not much traction in the large political parties. I would say that, for instance, in the Labour Party, who are going into primaries now because the leader resigned, Merav Michaeli resigned. It's definitely one of the topics that people are talking about, and Yair Golan, who's one of the candidates, his number one thing is about we need to have a vision for the day after, and we cannot just go blindly into this. When in the short year that the Netanyahu government was out, Yair Golan was responsible. He was a minister responsible for the Arab-Israeli population. So he has a fairly good understanding of Arab Israelis. And so there are some thoughts about this. I do think that the international community also needs to step up. There is just no realistic model, in my opinion, where Gaza is just going to be handed over to Palestinians. not at least without some kind of buffer, control, power sharing, whatever. And in a sense, we need like something like what happened to Germany after the Second World War, right? Which had, in a sense, an occupation, and that there were military forces from the Allies still stationed in Germany and had certain powers, but actually Germany was allowed to, and there was a Marshall Plan and so on. So I think there are models we can learn from, but both the international community has to step up, and there have to be some brave Israeli politicians stepping up. And it's not clear yet where the trend's going to go. There are a lot of people who are just really, really hurt. And I didn't even talk about the big elephant in the room, which is Lebanon. Like, I mean, everyone in Israel basically says tomorrow there will be a war with Lebanon. And it will be much more problematic and much more catastrophic. So hugely problematic. I realized that we're over time. So if people want to kind of leave, don't feel like you need to stick around. I will take further questions, but I want to give people the permission that it's late, and if they want to go off, they can go off.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine.
Yes, thank you. I had to leave the room for a minute, so you may have touched on this. So my apologies if you've already done this. Along with talking about the day after what happens, like the denazification in Germany, is there any optimism that a new generation can be re-educated out of all of this unbelievable hatred and, you know, brainwashing, or is there pessimism or optimism, or is it much discussed?
I think it really depends who you ask. I mean, I have to say I am the optimist in that. I think Nazi Germany is the perfect example of how quickly a country can become completely totalitarian and murderous, and how quickly people can go from murderous to being totally exemplary citizens who never do anything wrong anymore. I mean, we see this, like, you know, with a lot of these Nazi criminals who get caught after decades, that they live totally perfectly fine civil lives again and never did anyone any harm anymore after they've murdered thousands. So I think we can't give up hope. I think it's just like what I would say when people say, oh, you know, for every Palestinian child that you kill, you create another terrorist. I always say, well, you know, in Dresden, the Allies killed in one night about 25,000 civilians. And it's not like the entire city became terrorists forever against the British or Americans or so I think we mustn't lose hope is the answer. But there is a huge level of distrust, and it's difficult. It's going to be a challenge.
Thank you.
Angela.
I think a lot of people have covered some of the points I wanted to raise. I was concerned with the aftermath, and if so many Israelis feel that the war must continue now, first of all, do they then think that it's going to be an effective way of dealing with Hamas? Because there's this saying, you can't beat an ideology with military might. So that comes down to the ideology and what Catherine was saying and so on. So those really were the questions I'm thinking about now. So
I think you can't defeat an ideology with military might, but you can remove an ideology from political power with military might. And I think that's what when Israelis talk about removing Hamas, is they don't talk about every Hamas fighter and everyone who believes in Hamas ideology. But the reality is, if we look, for instance, at Egypt, right, the Muslim Brotherhood won the which is basically Hamas, won the elections in Egypt. They went into power, and there was a military coup, and dunk, they're done, right? Nobody's even talking about them anymore. So even with that ideology, it doesn't mean that they don't cause some problems. There's problems in the Sinai and so on. But actually, they're not really a significant threat to to Egyptian stability at the moment. So even specific to the case, we have examples where actually, yes, you can with military might remove ideologies from power. But you need someone to step into the gap that's left behind, right? In Egypt, it was obvious. The military basically just did a military coup and they stepped in. In Gaza, we can't have Israel stepping in and taking control. That's not going to work. And most Israelis don't believe that that is a viable option. I mean, there are some Israelis who believe that, but most Israelis don't believe that. Most Israelis say, you know, maybe international forces, something with the Palestinians, but most of them say we can't rule Gaza forever because it's just going to prolong this. And then we're going to be in a situation of second Lebanon war of attrition. And, you know, whereas Lebanon today, it hasn't made a bit of betterment in that sense to that situation. So I think people are not saying we're going to kill every Hamas believer, but they are saying we are going to remove them from power and from being able to set the curriculum and from being able to control the police and all of these other things.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I think we're going to keep it to an end. Thank you so much for the comments, and thank you, Jessie. If people are interested in specific things around Israel, themes, topics, I'm very happy to offer more things. The easiest probably is if you can send me a quick email. That way I don't forget things. I will send an email out to everyone with the recordings and an invitation to send me feedback and comments. So thank you so much to all of you for joining, and it's been really lovely to have